My foster father started treating my pregnant foster mother like she was invisible, like she was nothing more than a stranger living in our house. He wouldn't even look at her anymore, and when the mail came, he'd throw away her letters right in front of her, watching as her face crumbled with each envelope that hit the trash. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him why we never sat down for dinner together as a family anymore, he just stared at her growing belly with this look of pure disgust and said those words that still echo in my mind: "It's just easier this way." I didn't say anything back then. I was too scared, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening in our home. That was 11 months ago, and this morning I watched that same man sobbing uncontrollably in a courtroom while a judge terminated his parental rights forever. My foster father Christopher stopped showing any affection toward his wife Rachel the very moment she told him she was pregnant, and at first I genuinely believed he was just nervous about becoming a father, maybe overwhelmed by the responsibility. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice something much darker lurking beneath his cold exterior. Just 2 months before that pregnancy test changed everything, they were the couple that made everyone around them uncomfortable with their constant displays of affection. I'd roll my eyes and tell them to get a room when they'd kiss in the kitchen, and they'd just laugh and ruffle my hair. They were so in love it was almost annoying to watch, but in the best possible way. 8 weeks after that positive pregnancy test, when Rachel's baby bump was just beginning to show through her clothes, everything changed so dramatically it was like watching a completely different man inhabit Christopher's body. She'd reach for him on the couch, wanting to snuggle like they always used to during movie nights, and he'd suddenly remember an urgent phone call he needed to make. The leather recliner in the corner of our living room became his permanent residence, and I started catching him staring at her growing belly with an expression that made my stomach turn. It wasn't fear or anxiety I saw in his eyes. It was pure, undisguised revulsion. The grocery store trips became exercises in humiliation that made me want to disappear into the floor. Christopher would stride ahead like he was trying to distance himself from us, walking at least 5 or 6 feet in front while Rachel struggled with the shopping cart. Her beautiful maternity shirts would sometimes ride up when she reached for items on higher shelves, revealing the purple and pink stretch marks that traced across her skin like tiny rivers. And I'll never forget the sound he made when he saw them. It was this audible gasp of disgust, like he'd just witnessed something horrifying instead of the natural changes happening to the body of the woman carrying his child. He started implementing these bizarre rules about what she could wear around the house, insisting that she only dress in the baggiest, most shapeless clothes he could find. He'd actually go through her closet and remove anything that showed her pregnancy, claiming he couldn't stand to see her looking like that, as if her changing body was some kind of personal offense against him. I'd find him late at night in his study, scrolling through old photos of Rachel on his phone from before she was pregnant, and he'd look up at her as she passed by and ask with genuine confusion in his voice, "Where did that beautiful woman go?" As if the woman standing in front of him was a complete stranger. Every single night, I watched the same heartbreaking scene play out in their bedroom. Rachel would still reach for him across their king-sized bed, her hand searching for his in the darkness, hoping for even the smallest gesture of affection. But Christopher had started sleeping so close to the edge that I worried he might fall off. His entire body turned away from her, creating this vast ocean of cold sheets between them. He acted like her touch might contaminate him, like the woman he'd promised to love forever had become something repulsive that he couldn't bear to be near. The mornings were especially painful to witness. Rachel's pregnancy was progressing, and simple tasks like putting on her shoes had become increasingly difficult. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, struggling to reach her feet around her growing belly, breathing heavily from the effort. Christopher would stand in the doorway fully dressed, watching her struggle with that same expression of disgust etched across his face. He never offered to help, never bent down to assist her, just stood there observing her difficulty as if her physical limitations were somehow character flaws that justified his cruelty. Our family dinners, which used to be the highlight of my day, completely disappeared around the 5th month of her pregnancy. When I finally gathered enough courage to ask why we never ate together anymore, Christopher looked directly at Rachel's belly with such hatred that it made me flinch, then turned to me and said matter-of-factly that it was just easier this way. He started taking his meals in his study or standing at the kitchen counter, while Rachel and I ate at the dining table in silence, the empty chair at the head of the table a constant reminder of how fractured our family had become. The way he introduced her to people changed so dramatically it was like he was erasing their entire relationship history. We'd run into his co-workers at the store or around town, and instead of proudly introducing her as his wife like he used to, he'd gesture vaguely in her direction and mumble something about her being the kid's mother, as if that was her only identity now. I found out later that most of his colleagues didn't even know Rachel was pregnant until she showed up at his office one day to bring him lunch he'd forgotten. They were shocked because he'd never mentioned it, never shared the news that most expectant fathers can't stop talking about. Then came my cousin Emma's 8th birthday party, which Christopher transformed into an opportunity to publicly humiliate Rachel in front of our entire extended family. My Aunt Patricia rushed over to Rachel the moment we arrived, her face glowing with excitement as she gushed about how thrilled she must be about the baby. Christopher's response was to stare at Rachel's belly with such intense hatred that my aunt actually took a physical step backward, her smile faltering as she sensed the toxic energy radiating from him. When someone asked about the due date, trying to make normal conversation, Christopher simply walked away mid-sentence, leaving Rachel standing there alone to answer while he went to sulk by the food table. The language he used became deliberately cruel and distancing. He never said we're pregnant like other expectant fathers did. It was always she's pregnant, spoken with a tone that suggested she'd done this to herself, that he had no part in creating this life growing inside her. When Uncle Michael congratulated him on becoming a father, patting him on the back with genuine warmth, Christopher went completely silent. He just turned and stared at Rachel across the room, like she was the most repulsive creature he'd ever laid eyes on. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. I made the innocent mistake of telling someone at the party that I was excited about becoming a big brother, and Christopher immediately interrupted me with venom in his voice. Big brother to her baby, he corrected sharply, making sure everyone understood that this child was not his, would never be his, in his mind. The other adults exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. No one challenged him on his bizarre and cruel behavior. When dinner was served at the party and Rachel went back for a second helping of food, Christopher made a loud comment about her getting big enough already. The room went silent, forks suspended midway to mouths as everyone processed what he'd just said. Rachel's mother, Linda, immediately came to her daughter's defense, telling Rachel she was eating for 2 and should have as much as she wanted, that her changing body was beautiful and natural. Christopher's response was to stand up dramatically, his chair scraping against the floor, and announce that we were leaving. He made such a scene that everyone was staring as he stormed out, leaving Rachel to waddle after him while trying to hold back tears. That night marked the beginning of his campaign to isolate me from Rachel. He started insisting on taking over my bedtime routine, claiming Rachel needed her rest. What began as once or twice a week quickly escalated until he was tucking me in every single night, deliberately excluding her from these precious moments we used to share. Even when I could hear Rachel in the living room, clearly awake and probably lonely, he'd intercept any attempt I made to spend time with her. His constant refrain became "Mom's tired from the baby," spoken with a tone that suggested the baby was already a burden, already taking her away from us. When I'd try to ask Rachel questions about her day or show her my schoolwork, Christopher would physically step between us. "Don't bother, Mom," he'd say, as if her pregnancy had made her too fragile or too disinterested to engage with me. The truth was that Rachel's eyes would light up whenever I managed to sneak past his barriers, desperate for the connection he was systematically destroying. As walking became more difficult for Rachel in her 3rd trimester, Christopher used her physical limitations as another weapon in his psychological warfare. When she couldn't play outside with me anymore because her swollen feet and aching back made it too painful, he'd shake his head with theatrical disappointment. "Mom's different now, isn't she?" he'd say to me, planting seeds of resentment in my young mind. He wanted me to blame her for things beyond her control, to see her pregnancy as something that was stealing my mother away. The photo albums came out constantly during this period. Christopher would pull out pictures from before Rachel was pregnant, pointing at them with exaggerated nostalgia. "Remember when Mum used to be fun?" he'd ask, showing me pictures of Rachel playing soccer with me in the backyard or pushing me on the swings at the park. He'd trace his finger over her slim figure in the photos, making sure I noticed the difference between then and now. The implication was clear that the woman carrying his child was inferior to the woman in those photographs, that pregnancy had somehow diminished her value. When Rachel missed one of my baseball practices because she had an important prenatal appointment, Christopher pounced on the opportunity like a predator sensing weakness. "She only thinks about the baby now," he told me in the car on the way home, his voice dripping with false concern for my feelings. "See how she's already choosing the baby over you," he added, watching my face in the rearview mirror to gauge the impact of his words. I remember feeling confused and hurt, not understanding that he was manipulating me, turning me against the woman who loved me most in the world. The physical challenges of late pregnancy became more pronounced, and Christopher used each one as evidence of Rachel's inadequacy. Watching her struggle up the stairs, gripping the railing with white knuckles while pausing every few steps to catch her breath, he'd turn to me with that poisonous smile. "See how slow she is," he'd comment casually. "That's why we don't wait for her anymore." He was teaching me to be impatient with her limitations, to see her struggles as inconveniences rather than the natural consequences of growing a human life inside her body. His comments grew progressively darker as the due date approached. "You and me, buddy, we were perfectly fine before all this happened," he'd say during our forced father-son time, painting Rachel's pregnancy as an intrusion into our previously happy life. Then came the most insidious lie of all, delivered with practiced casualness during one of our bedtime talks. "Real parents always love their real children more than foster kids," he said, planting the fear that would keep me awake for countless nights. "It's just biology, kiddo, nothing personal." Rachel's baby shower should have been a joyful celebration, but Christopher turned it into another opportunity to damage my relationship with her. While she opened gifts surrounded by her friends and family members who still cared, he pulled me aside to the corner of the room. "After this baby comes, you're going to be forgotten," he whispered urgently, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "That's just what happens when people have their real kids. They don't need the foster ones anymore." When Rachel called me over to help her open a particularly large gift, needing assistance with the ribbons, Christopher physically held me back. "She doesn't need you anymore," he said loud enough for others to hear. "She has her baby now." The cruelty escalated to the point where he stopped using her name entirely. In our house, Rachel became she or her when he was forced to reference her at all. When speaking to our neighbors, he referred to her as the tenant, as if she was just someone renting space in his home rather than his wife. I watched him systematically remove her from every shared account they had. First, it was Netflix, where her profile disappeared overnight. Then the joint bank account, where her name was quietly removed. The phone plan was next, followed by every other trace of their partnership. The mail situation became particularly cruel. Christopher would stand by the mailbox each day, sorting through the letters with Rachel watching from the window. Bills addressed to her, appointment reminders from her doctor, cards from her sister Sarah who lived across the country, all of them went directly into the trash can. He'd make eye contact with her through the window as he did it, a small smile playing on his lips as her shoulders sagged with each discarded envelope. When she tried to retrieve them later, she'd find he'd already taken the trash to the outside bins, destroying any chance she had of maintaining connections with the outside world. The small cruelties accumulated daily. When Rachel dropped her fork at dinner one night, her swollen fingers no longer as dexterous as they used to be, Christopher watched it fall. Instead of picking it up like any decent human being would do, he actually kicked it further away from her. I watched in horror as my pregnant foster mother struggled to bend down, her face red with effort and humiliation, while he continued eating as if nothing had happened. I jumped up to get it for her, but he snapped at me to sit down, that she could manage on her own. The prenatal vitamins became another battleground in his war against her pregnancy. The doctor had prescribed them to ensure both Rachel and the baby stayed healthy, but Christopher saw them as symbols of the pregnancy he despised. I caught him throwing the bottles in the garbage while Rachel watched, her hands pressed protectively over her belly. When she tried to retrieve them, he blocked her path. "You don't need those expensive pills," he'd say. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years without them." But we both knew it wasn't about the money. It was about control, about punishing her for being pregnant. Transportation became another tool of control. Christopher started hiding Rachel's car keys whenever she had a doctor's appointment, forcing her to beg for rides or miss important checkups. He'd pretend to help look for them, walking around the house with feigned concern while knowing exactly where he'd hidden them. By the time they were found, always in some unlikely place like behind the washing machine or in the garage freezer, it would be too late for her appointment. The missed appointments led to concerned calls from the doctor's office, which Christopher would intercept and dismiss. I'll never forget the day Rachel started choking on water at dinner. It should have been a moment of immediate action, but Christopher didn't even look up from the television. She was coughing desperately, her face turning red, one hand clutching her throat while the other pressed against her belly protectively. I had learned the Heimlich maneuver in a school safety program, and even though I was terrified, I jumped up and wrapped my small arms around her from behind. It took 3 tries before the water dislodged, and she could breathe again. Through it all, Christopher kept watching his sports program, the volume turned up high enough to drown out the sounds of her distress. The public incidents became more frequent and more frightening. Rachel collapsed while we were shopping at Target one afternoon, the combination of stress, malnutrition, and pregnancy taking its toll. She crumpled to the floor in the cereal aisle, and Christopher, who was just one aisle over, pretended not to notice. Other shoppers rushed to help while he studied a box of crackers with intense concentration. I ran to find a store employee, tears streaming down my face as I begged for help. Security called an ambulance, and as they loaded Rachel onto a stretcher, Christopher finally wandered over with studied casualness. "I'll meet you there," he said without emotion, but he never showed up at the hospital. The abdominal pains started in her 7th month, sharp cramping that would leave Rachel doubled over and gasping. The first time it happened during dinner, she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she tried to breathe through the pain. Christopher's response was to reach for the remote and turn up the volume on the television, drowning out her labored breathing with the sound of a laugh track from some sitcom. I held her hand while she rode out the pain, my 10-year-old mind trying to understand how the man who was supposed to protect her could be so callous. Then came my 10th birthday. A day that should have been filled with joy, but instead became the moment I truly understood the depth of Christopher's cruelty. Rachel had stayed up most of the night decorating despite barely being able to sleep in her 8th month of pregnancy. She'd hung streamers and balloons, baked my favorite chocolate cake from scratch, and made special pancakes in the shape of the number 10. Her face was puffy from exhaustion, but glowing with love as she wished me happy birthday. That's when Christopher walked into the kitchen and delivered his ultimatum. "You need to leave," he said to Rachel, his voice cold and final. She shook her head slightly, her eyes pleading with him to reconsider. "Either you leave for the entire day, or I take him somewhere else for his birthday. I can't stand being in the same house as you." The words hung in the air like poison while Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She'd spent weeks planning this day, making sure everything would be perfect despite her physical discomfort. I ran to Rachel immediately, wrapping my arms around her legs as much as her belly would allow. "I want to spend my birthday with Mom," I cried. But Christopher grabbed my arm and pulled me back roughly. "No, you're staying here with me. We're going to have a real party without her." I was sobbing now, trying to break free to get back to Rachel, but his grip was too strong. She knelt down despite the difficulty, taking my tear-stained face in her hands. "It's okay, sweetie. You stay and enjoy your special day. You've been so excited about your party, and I don't want you to miss it." Christopher literally dragged me away as I screamed for her, my hands reaching out desperately. "Mom, please don't go. Please stay for my birthday." But he shut the door in her face, and I pressed my face against the window, watching through my tears as she walked slowly to her car. She had to stop twice to catch her breath, one hand supporting her back, the other pressed against her belly. Even from inside, I could see her shoulders shaking with sobs as she drove away, leaving me to celebrate my birthday without the one person who truly loved me. That night, the guilt ate at me like acid in my stomach. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as I thought about Rachel spending my birthday alone somewhere, probably crying. The party Christopher threw was elaborate but hollow, filled with kids from school who didn't really know me and parents who whispered about Rachel's absence. When they asked where my mum was, Christopher told them she wasn't feeling well, but his smirk told a different story. The pile of presents meant nothing when I opened them without her there to see my excitement. Around midnight, when the house was quiet and Christopher was snoring in his recliner, I crept to the kitchen and found Rachel's favourite cookies in the pantry. She always said they reminded her of her grandmother, and I thought maybe they could serve as an apology for my birthday happening without her. I wanted to leave them on her nightstand as a surprise, a small gesture to show her that I'd been thinking about her all day even when she wasn't allowed to be there. The master bedroom door was slightly open, and I could hear the shower running. Perfect timing, I thought, as I slipped inside and approached her nightstand. I pulled open the drawer carefully, planning to hide the cookies under her reading glasses where she'd find them in the morning. But instead of the usual collection of bookmarks and hair ties, I found a manila envelope that would change everything. Inside were medical documents, and though I was young, I could read well enough to understand the headers. "Paternity test results," the paper declared in bold letters. My hands shook as I read further, the clinical language confusing, but the results clear. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0%. Christopher was not the father of Rachel's baby. The test was dated 5 months ago, which aligned perfectly with when Christopher's behaviour had transformed from loving husband to cruel tormentor. I didn't fully understand the implications, but I knew this was important, possibly dangerous information. The shower water stopped, and panic flooded through me. With trembling fingers, I grabbed Rachel's phone from the nightstand and quickly took 3 photos of the test results, making sure to capture all the important details. I had just shoved everything back in the drawer when I heard the bathroom door open. I ran back to my room and dove under the covers, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it through the walls. Through the crack under my door, I watched Rachel's shadow pause at her dresser. Then I heard a strange, strangled gasp, like someone had punched her in the stomach. She must have opened that drawer, must have seen that I'd disturbed the papers. The gasping turned to quiet sobbing, and I heard her whispering something over and over, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a prayer or maybe an apology. The next morning painted a stark picture of the inequality in our household. Rachel was in the bathroom, dealing with severe morning sickness that had gotten worse as her pregnancy progressed. I could hear her retching violently, the sound echoing off the bathroom tiles. Christopher sat in his recliner, calmly sipping his coffee and watching sports highlights. When a particularly loud bout of vomiting interrupted his viewing, he simply reached for the remote and turned the volume up higher, as if he could drown out the reality of her suffering. I couldn't stand it anymore. I filled a glass with cold water and grabbed a clean washcloth from the hall closet, then knocked softly on the bathroom door. Rachel was sitting on the floor, her back against the bathtub, looking pale and exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled as she reached for the water. When I knelt beside her and pressed the cool cloth to her forehead, she pulled me into a desperate hug. I felt her tears dropping onto my hair as she held me like I might disappear at any moment. Breakfast brought another shock. Christopher announced with no prior discussion or warning that I would be switching schools on Monday. Rachel's fork clattered against her plate, and she started to protest, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. It's already done. He starts Monday at Riverside Academy. The school was 45 minutes away in a completely different district. Rachel's face cycled through emotions, disbelief, anger, despair, before settling into a defeated acceptance. She stared at her untouched eggs while I tried to process what this meant. A new school so far from home, away from all my friends and the teachers who knew me. Later that afternoon, while Rachel napped fitfully on the couch, exhaustion finally overcoming her anxiety, I made a decision that could have gotten me in serious trouble. I carefully took her phone and started scrolling through her text messages, looking for clues about what was really happening in our family. What I found made my blood run cold. There were dozens of messages from someone saved as Mom, dating back 2 months. Linda had been begging Rachel to come home, to leave Christopher, saying he wasn't who she thought he was. The messages grew increasingly desperate. He's dangerous, honey. Please come home before it's too late. Let me help you. Rachel's responses started out defensive, insisting everything was fine, that Christopher was just stressed about becoming a father. But as the weeks progressed, her messages changed. She started asking for help, admitting she was scared, that things were getting worse. Then, abruptly, the responses from Linda stopped. The last message from Rachel, sent 3 weeks ago, simply said, "Mom, please answer me. I need you." But there was nothing after that, just Rachel's increasingly desperate pleas going unanswered. That weekend, Rachel asked me to help her fold the baby clothes she'd bought back when the pregnancy was still a source of joy. We sat on the living room floor, surrounded by tiny onesies and sleepers in soft pastels. Her hands shook as she pulled out a pink onesie that read, "Daddy's Girl," in glittery letters. The pain that crossed her face was so raw I had to look away. She quickly shoved it deep into the drawer, treating it like it was contaminated. As we folded, she kept whispering things I couldn't quite catch, except for one phrase that came through clearly. Some things just aren't meant to be. Monday arrived with a sense of dread that sat heavy in my stomach. The new school was a massive building that seemed designed to make kids feel small and insignificant. The secretary at the front desk frowned as she processed my paperwork, commenting multiple times on how unusual it was to get a transfer this late in the school year, especially from a district so far away. "Why would they move you all the way here?" she muttered, shaking her head. I memorized every detail of that long bus ride, counting turns, noting landmarks, watching for anything that might help me find my way back if I needed to. The next week brought a small mercy. Rachel had a prenatal appointment, and surprisingly, Christopher agreed to let me accompany her. His easy acceptance should have been a warning sign, but I was too happy about spending time with Rachel to question it. At the clinic, Dr. Patterson took one look at Rachel, and her expression changed from professional courtesy to genuine concern. She asked about Rachel's significant weight loss, noting that she should be gaining weight at this stage, not losing it. Then she noticed the bruises on Rachel's arms, purple and yellow marks in the shape of fingers. The doctor sent me to the waiting room, but the walls were thin, and I could hear her asking Rachel gentle but probing questions. "Are you safe at home? Is someone hurting you? Do you need help?" Rachel's responses were barely audible, insisting she just bruised easily, that everything was fine, that she was just stressed about the baby. But Dr. Patterson didn't sound convinced. I heard her mention resources for domestic violence victims, saw her slip pamphlets into Rachel's bag when she thought no one was looking. A few nights later, I discovered Christopher's secret phone calls. He'd started going out to the garage after dinner, claiming he needed to work on projects. But there were never any sounds of tools or evidence of anything being built or fixed. Curious and increasingly suspicious, I remembered the old tablet Christopher had given me that he thought was broken. I'd figured out how to fix it months ago but never told him. I grabbed it from behind the paint cans where I'd been hiding it and crept to the door connecting the garage to the house. Christopher's voice carried clearly in the quiet night. "She has nowhere to go," he was saying. "Her family cut her off months ago, just like I planned. The kid's adoption isn't final yet. I need more time to get everything in place." Then, after a pause, Don't worry, I'll make sure she can't fight for custody. By the time I'm done, she'll be lucky if they let her see the kid through glass once a month. I hit record on the tablet, my hands shaking as I captured evidence of his plotting. He talked about moving money, about making Rachel look unstable, about documenting everything that could be used against her in court. When I crept back to my room, my mind was reeling. The phrase "getting things in place" kept echoing in my head. What exactly was he planning? How much worse could this get? I fell asleep clutching the tablet, the recording saved in a password-protected folder I'd created for important things. Even at 10 years old, I understood that information was power, and I was gathering as much as I could. The following evening provided a brief respite from the tension. Rachel was on the couch knitting a tiny yellow blanket for the baby. The repetitive motions seemed to calm her, and for once her face looked peaceful. Christopher hadn't been home for dinner all week, claiming work obligations but probably just avoiding Rachel's presence. She winced suddenly, grabbing her belly, and I ran for the heating pad without being asked. As I helped her position it against her aching back, she touched my face with such tenderness it made my chest tight. "You're such a good boy," she whispered. "Promise me you'll always be good, no matter what happens." The next morning changed everything once again. While Christopher was in the shower, I went to his home office looking for my library book. Instead, I found bank statements sticking out of the trash can, and curiosity got the better of me. What I discovered made my stomach drop. There were massive withdrawals from their joint account, $500 here, $800 there, sometimes multiple withdrawals in a single day. The balance had dwindled from tens of thousands to almost nothing. At the bottom of the trash, I found Rachel's debit card cut into 4 precise pieces, along with a letter from the bank. The letter stated that her card had been reported lost and a new one would be sent to the primary account holder, which was Christopher. Everything clicked into place. He was systematically cutting off her access to money, ensuring she couldn't leave even if she wanted to. I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, but my mind was racing. Yesterday, Rachel had asked Christopher for grocery money, and he'd claimed they were tight on cash. Now I knew the truth. He had money. He just wasn't going to let her have any of it. That Sunday, Christopher's brother David and his wife Margaret came for dinner. It was supposed to be a normal family meal, but the tension was palpable from the moment they arrived. David kept watching Rachel with worried eyes as she moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing the meal despite obviously being in pain. When we finally sat down to eat, Rachel reached for the salt, but her swollen fingers couldn't maintain their grip on her fork. It clattered to the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet dining room. What Christopher did next was so cruel it took my breath away. He picked up the fork, but instead of washing it or getting her a clean one, he placed it on the counter out of her reach. "You can eat with your hands," he said casually, "since you can't handle utensils properly anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's face flushed deep red as tears began rolling down her cheeks. David shot up from his chair so fast it scraped against the floor, his face twisted with rage. Margaret grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, but I could see her hand shaking. Rachel picked up her chicken with her fingers, trying to maintain some dignity as she ate like a toddler, while the rest of us had proper utensils. Each bite seemed to require enormous effort, not because of the physical act, but because of the humiliation. David's jaw was clenched so tight, I worried his teeth might crack. Margaret kept clearing her throat like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite completely gone as I watched my foster mother be degraded in her own home. The rest of the dinner passed in excruciating silence, broken only by the sound of silverware against plates and Rachel's quiet sniffles. When David and Margaret left, Margaret hugged Rachel for a long time at the door, whispering something I couldn't hear. David glared at his brother with undisguised contempt, but said nothing. After they were gone, Christopher seemed pleased with himself. Humming as he cleared the dishes Rachel wasn't allowed to touch with her apparently inadequate hands. A week later, I woke up with severe stomach pains that had me doubled over in bed. Whether it was stress or an actual illness, I didn't know, but Rachel let me stay home from school. Despite her own discomfort, she spent the morning teaching me to bake, pulling out her grandmother's old recipe box that she treasured. Her movements were slow and careful, but her face lit up as she showed me how to cream butter and sugar, how to roll dough to the perfect thickness. "These recipes need to be passed down," she kept saying, making me write each step in my notebook. Someone needs to remember them. We spent hours in that kitchen, the sweet smell of cookies filling the air. Rachel told stories about her grandmother, about learning these same recipes as a little girl. She smiled more that morning than I'd seen in months, though she had to sit down every few minutes to rest. Her phone buzzed on the counter and I answered it since her hands were covered in flour. The voice on the other end was urgent. "This is Dr. Patterson's office. We need Rachel to come in immediately regarding some concerning test results from her last appointment." Before I could hand the phone to Rachel, Christopher appeared in the doorway. He snatched the phone from my hand and told the nurse that Rachel was fine and would keep her regular appointment next week. The nurse tried to insist it was urgent, but he hung up on her. When Rachel asked who called, he shrugged and said it was just a telemarketer. I watched him delete the call from her phone history, adding another lie to his growing collection. Rachel returned to our baking, unaware that her doctor was trying desperately to reach her about something important. The next day at school, something finally broke inside me. After the final bell, I lingered in Mrs. Peterson's classroom. She was my favorite teacher, a kind woman who always seemed to notice when kids were struggling. I stood by her desk, my backpack weighing heavy on my shoulders, and told her I was worried about my foster mom. The words came out in a rush, like a dam breaking. She's pregnant and sick, and my dad is mean to her and won't let her eat with forks and hides her car keys and throws away her medicine. Mrs. Peterson's face grew increasingly concerned as I spoke. She asked gentle questions, careful not to lead me but encouraging me to share what I felt comfortable saying. When I finished, she pulled out a piece of paper and wrote her personal cell phone number on it. She tucked it into my backpack's front pocket and knelt down to my level. "Listen to me," she said seriously. "If you ever feel unsafe, or if you think Rachel is in danger, you call me. Anytime, day or night. I'm going to talk to some people who can help, but I need you to be careful and stay safe." That weekend, I watched in growing alarm as Christopher installed new locks on all the bedroom doors. But these weren't normal locks, they were backwards, locking from the outside instead of the inside. When I asked him about it, he said it was for safety, but I couldn't understand how locking people in their rooms could make anyone safer. I watched him test the lock on the master bedroom door while Rachel was napping, and the key went straight onto his keychain with all the others. The implications made my skin crawl. He could now lock Rachel in her room whenever he wanted. 2 weeks later, the situation reached a crisis point. Rachel was making lunch when she suddenly grabbed her stomach and cried out. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her face contorting with pain. "The baby, something's wrong with the baby." Without thinking, I ran to the kitchen phone and dialed 911, my voice high and panicked as I gave our address. Christopher stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, insisting she was being dramatic, that she was just trying to get attention. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional demeanor a stark contrast to Christopher's callous indifference. They examined Rachel quickly, their faces grave as they announced she was having contractions at only 34 weeks. "This is serious," one of them told Christopher. "She needs immediate hospital care or we could lose both mother and baby." Christopher shrugged like they were discussing the weather. He refused to ride in the ambulance with her, telling me we'd visit tomorrow if she was actually admitted and not just making a fuss over nothing. At the hospital the next day, I sat in the waiting room while Christopher talked to doctors. The conversation wasn't as private as he thought, and I could hear the nurses at their station discussing Rachel's condition. The words they used painted a terrifying picture: dehydration, malnutrition, extreme stress, possible preeclampsia. One nurse was reading from a chart, her voice concerned. "These test results are alarming. Has she been getting proper prenatal care?" Another nurse mentioned that Dr. Patterson had ordered a social services consultation, that there were red flags all over this case. I memorized every word, storing it away with all the other evidence I'd been collecting. But who would believe a 10-year-old kid over a respectable adult man? Who would take my word against his? The weight of responsibility felt crushing. I knew things that could help Rachel, but I didn't know how to make anyone listen to me. The tablet with the recording was hidden under my mattress. The photos of the paternity test were on Rachel's phone, but I was just a kid in a system that rarely listened to kids. Margaret showed up at the hospital the next day while Christopher was at work, despite his explicit instructions that Rachel wasn't to have visitors. She brought me with her, and we found Rachel hooked up to multiple machines that beeped steadily, monitoring her and the baby. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, taking Rachel's hand gently but firmly. "David and I see what's happening," she said, her voice low but fierce. "We're going to help you get out of this. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Rachel started sobbing so hard that the machines began beeping faster, bringing a nurse rushing in. The nurse checked the monitors and adjusted Rachel's IV, her expression concerned. As she worked, we could hear Christopher's voice booming down the hallway, getting closer. My whole body went cold with fear. I recognized that tone. It meant trouble for everyone in his path. Without thinking, I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door, pressing my ear against it to hear what would happen. Through the door, I could hear Christopher berating Margaret for visiting against his wishes. His voice was loud enough that other visitors must have heard, but he didn't seem to care about making a scene. "How dare you come here? This is my family, not yours. Stay away from my wife." Margaret's voice remained calm, but I could hear her phone making the distinctive beep it makes when you start recording video. She was documenting his behavior, gathering evidence just like I had been. The confrontation continued for several minutes, with Christopher growing increasingly agitated and Margaret refusing to back down. Finally, I heard security arrive, asking if there was a problem. Christopher insisted Margaret was harassing his wife, but other visitors had seen him as the aggressor. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, things quieted down. Margaret knocked softly on the bathroom door, telling me it was safe to come out. 2 days later, the hospital released Rachel, though she still looked terribly fragile. Christopher made her sign multiple forms at the discharge desk, papers she was too exhausted to read properly. I watched him fold them carefully and put them in his briefcase, another piece of his plan falling into place. The drive home was silent except for Rachel's occasional whimpers when we hit bumps in the road. The baby wasn't due for 6 more weeks, but it felt like everything was balanced on a knife's edge. That same week, a woman named Patricia Williams from Child Services tried to interview me at school. The principal called me to the office, where Ms. Williams was waiting with a kind smile and a folder full of official-looking papers. But before we could talk, the secretary knocked on the door. "There's a phone call from the student's guardian," she said apologetically. The principal took the call, his face growing frustrated as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to Ms. Williams. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Thompson insists that no one speaks to his foster son without him present. Without legal grounds to override him, we have to respect his wishes." Ms. Williams looked disappointed but gave me a meaningful look as she gathered her papers. "Sometimes these things take time," she said carefully. "But we don't give up." She made sure I saw her business card before she put it back in her folder, letting me know she hadn't forgotten about me. As I walked back to class, I wondered if Christopher knew about the recording on my tablet, about the photos on Rachel's phone, about all the evidence I'd been gathering. Was that why he was working so hard to keep Child Services away from me? I started my own small rebellion after that, sneaking supplies to Rachel whenever possible. I filled my school backpack with granola bars and water bottles, slipping them under her pillow when Christopher watched television. I became an expert at fishing her prenatal vitamins out of the trash, hiding them in places she would find them later. One night, she discovered my stash while changing her pillowcase. I watched from the doorway as she held the vitamins and snack bars, tears streaming down her face. She looked up and saw me, mouthing thank you before quickly hiding everything. During computer class at school, I took a huge risk. While the teacher was helping another student, I quickly logged into Facebook using the library computer. I searched for Linda Morrison, Rachel's mother, and found her profile easily. It was full of posts that made my heart ache. "Please, Christopher, let me talk to my daughter one read." I just need to know she and the baby are okay. Another said, Rachel, if you see this, we love you and want you to come home. The most recent post from just 2 days ago was addressed to Christopher directly. You can't keep her from her family forever. We know what you're doing. I took screenshots of everything, quickly emailing them to Mrs. Peterson's email address that she'd given our class for submitting homework. I added a subject line about extra credit to avoid suspicion, hoping she would understand the real purpose when she saw the contents. My heart pounded as I logged out and cleared the browser history, terrified that somehow Christopher would find out what I'd done. But I knew Rachel's family was looking for her. And maybe, just maybe, this information could help reunite them. That Friday afternoon, Christopher announced we were going camping for the weekend, just the two of us. His tone suggested this was a special treat, but the timing felt ominous. Rachel tried to stand from the couch, asking if she could come too. She moved slowly, one hand supporting her back, the other protecting her belly. Christopher looked at her with that familiar disgust and said walking would be too much for someone in her condition. The way he said condition made it sound like a disease rather than a pregnancy. While Christopher loaded camping gear into his truck, I saw Rachel slip something into my backpack. Her movements were subtle, but I caught the desperation in her eyes. She knew something I didn't, sensed some danger that I was too young to fully understand. The 3-hour drive to the campsite was filled with Christopher's monologue about how nice it was to have guy time, how things used to be before Rachel got pregnant, how much simpler life was without women and their complications. We set up our tent near a babbling creek, and Christopher seemed almost like his old self as we roasted hot dogs over the campfire. But there was something forced about his cheerfulness, something calculated in the way he kept bringing the conversation back to our future together. That night, after he started snoring in his sleeping bag, I used my flashlight to read the note Rachel had hidden in my backpack. Her handwriting was shaky, the words smudged in places by what could only have been tears. My brave boy, it began. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't find another way to tell you the truth. In my nightstand drawer are papers that explain why Christopher hates me now. The baby isn't his. I made a terrible mistake during a time when we were separated, and now an innocent child will pay the price. But you need to know that no matter what happens, you are my son in every way that matters. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Be brave, my sweet boy. Be brave and remember that real family is made of love, not blood. Forever your mum, Rachel. My hands shook as I read and reread the letter. She thought something bad was going to happen while we were gone. She was saying goodbye. I folded the letter carefully and hid it in my sleeping bag, my mind racing. What was Christopher planning? Why did he really bring me out here? I lay awake most of the night, jumping at every sound outside the tent, wondering if Rachel would still be there when we got home. The next morning, Christopher made pancakes on the camping stove, acting like Father of the Year. But his questions revealed his true purpose. He wanted to know how I would feel about living with just him if something happened to Rachel. He painted pictures of a life without her, just us guys doing whatever we wanted. No more dealing with pregnancy hormones or baby stuff. Some kids only have dads, he said casually, flipping a pancake. They turn out just fine. Maybe even better without all that emotional female stuff getting in the way. I played along, forcing enthusiasm into my voice while my stomach churned. Yeah, that could be cool, I lied, watching his face relax at my response. Inside, I was screaming. I thought about Rachel alone in that house, heavily pregnant and vulnerable, and I wanted to run all the way home. But I had to be smart, had to gather information. So I asked careful questions, pretending to be excited about our potential future together while trying to figure out what he was planning. When Christopher went to use the campground's bathroom facilities, I saw my chance. His phone was sitting on the picnic table, and I grabbed it with trembling fingers. I quickly typed out a text to Mrs. Peterson from his phone. This is Tyler. Rachel needs help. Please check on her. We're camping and I'm scared for her. I hit send before I could lose my nerve, then deleted the message from his sent folder. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it when he came back, but he seemed oblivious, continuing his father-son performance. The drive home Sunday morning was torture. Christopher sang along to the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, acting like we'd just had the best weekend ever. Meanwhile, I stared out the window, watching the miles tick by too slowly, praying we wouldn't be too late. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my worst fears seemed confirmed. The front door was standing wide open, something that would never happen if everything was okay. I jumped out of the truck before it fully stopped, racing toward the house. Christopher followed slowly, stepping over the threshold with careful deliberation. That's when I found her. Rachel was on the bathroom floor, surrounded by a puddle of clear fluid. Her water had broken, and she was clutching her belly, moaning in pain. She looked up at me with terrified eyes, too weak to speak. Christopher literally stepped over her prone form to get to the kitchen, like she was nothing more than a pile of dirty laundry on the floor. Without hesitation, I ran to the house phone and dialed 911, screaming our address repeatedly until the dispatcher assured me help was on the way. Christopher tried to grab the phone from me, but I dodged him and ran outside to the front yard, still yelling our address into the phone. I stood on the lawn like a beacon, making sure the ambulance would find us quickly. Those 8 minutes felt like hours as I ran between the front yard and the bathroom, where Rachel was struggling through contractions alone. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with professional efficiency that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the scene. They quickly assessed Rachel's condition and loaded her onto a stretcher. She begged them to let me ride with her, reaching for me with a desperate hand. Christopher announced he wasn't coming because this wasn't his problem, but the paramedics ignored him. One of them, a kind woman with greying hair, helped me into the ambulance. "You're a brave kid," she said quietly. "You might have saved 2 lives today." At the hospital, the medical team rushed Rachel directly to the delivery room. The baby was 5 weeks early and there was no time to waste. Rachel pleaded with the doctors to let me stay with her, and given Christopher's absence, they agreed. I stood by her head, letting her squeeze my hand through each contraction. The pain must have been unbearable because she nearly broke my fingers, but I didn't let go. I whispered the encouragement she'd always given me when things were hard. "You're brave, you're strong, you can do this." After 2 hours that felt like days, the doctor finally announced that the baby was crowning. "Push, Rachel. One more big push," she encouraged. Rachel bore down with a primal scream, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, the angry cry of a newborn. The doctor lifted the baby for us to see, and in that moment, everything made horrible sense. The baby had beautiful dark skin and a head full of black curls. The contrast to Christopher's pale complexion and straight blonde hair was undeniable. The room fell silent except for the baby's cries. The nurses exchanged knowing looks but maintained their professionalism. As they cleaned and wrapped the baby, one nurse murmured to another about updating the social services report. Rachel was crying, but they were tears of joy mixed with relief. "It's a girl," the doctor announced warmly, as if the baby's appearance hadn't just confirmed every suspicion about why Christopher had been so cruel. Rachel looked at me with those exhausted but loving eyes and said, "Her name is Grace. Grace Patricia, after the people who tried to help us. Would you like to hold your sister first?" "My sister. Not the baby, not her daughter, but my sister." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The nurse showed me how to support Grace's head, and then this tiny, perfect person was in my arms. Her eyes were closed, her little fist wrapped around my finger with surprising strength. "She's so small," I whispered, afraid I might break her. Rachel smiled through her tears. "But she's strong, just like her big brother. You're going to protect her, aren't you? Always help her the way you've helped me." I nodded solemnly, understanding that this was more than just a request. It was a sacred trust. The nurse took pictures of the 3 of us with Rachel's phone, capturing the moment when our real family was born, not from shared genes, but from shared love and survival. 2 days passed in the hospital with Rachel getting stronger and learning to care for Grace. The nurses were incredibly kind, showing her how to breastfeed, how to change tiny diapers, how to swaddle Grace so she felt secure. I spent every allowed moment there, feeding Grace bottles when Rachel needed rest, singing the lullabies Rachel had taught me, watching in wonder as this tiny person responded to my voice. Then Christopher finally showed up, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. He stood in the doorway, his face twisted with disgust as he looked at Grace. He wouldn't even cross the threshold, as if entering the room might contaminate him. When the nurse brought him papers to sign for the birth certificate, he pushed them away violently. "I'm not signing anything for that," he spat, pointing at Grace like she was garbage. "That's not my kid, and everyone can see it." The nurse called for Dr. Patterson, who arrived quickly, having been briefed on the situation. She tried to speak calmly to Christopher about legal responsibilities and the best interests of the child, but he started yelling. "Fraud," he kept saying. "She committed fraud. She made me think it was mine. She's a liar and a cheater, and I want nothing to do with either of them." Hospital security arrived when Christopher grabbed my arm, trying to drag me toward the exit. "You're coming home with me," he snarled. "You're my son, not hers." Security blocked the door while I struggled against his grip. The head of security, a large man with kind eyes, spoke firmly. "Sir, you need to let go of the child. We've been informed there's an ongoing investigation and you can't remove him without proper documentation." Christopher's face turned purple with rage, but he released my arm. More security arrived, and they formed a protective barrier between us. Within an hour, Patricia Williams from Child Services arrived with a thick folder and 2 colleagues. She took me to a quiet room where a woman with glasses and a gentle smile asked me questions. I showed them everything: the photos on my phone of the locks Christopher installed, the bruises on Rachel's arms that I'd documented, the recording from the tablet of him planning to take me away from her. Patricia's expression grew more serious with each piece of evidence. She asked me directly if I felt safe going home with Christopher. I shook my head so hard my neck hurt. "He scares me," I admitted. "And he hurt Rachel. He wanted the baby to die." I could tell from the way he wouldn't let her eat or take her vitamins. He wanted them both to disappear. The woman with glasses exchanged a look with Patricia, and I knew they believed me. For the first time in months, I felt like adults were actually listening, actually going to do something to help. That afternoon was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret and David arrived at the hospital with bags of my clothes and toys from home. Margaret hugged me tightly, whispering that they'd been documenting everything too. David pulled out his phone and showed Patricia a folder full of photos he'd secretly taken at family dinners, showing Rachel's injuries, her weight loss, the way Christopher treated her. "We wanted to do something sooner," David admitted, his voice thick with guilt. "But we didn't know how. We were gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. The right moment seemed to have arrived." The next morning, Christopher burst into the hospital with a man in an expensive suit who announced he was Christopher's attorney. They had papers, legal documents that Christopher claimed gave him full custody of me. The lawyer waved them around, insisting I had to leave with them immediately. But Patricia Williams stood her ground, placing herself physically between them and me. "There's an active investigation into abuse and neglect," she stated calmly. "This child is not going anywhere until a judge reviews all the evidence." Christopher's composure finally cracked completely. He started screaming threats, saying he'd sue everyone: the hospital, child services, the security guards, even the janitor who was mopping nearby. His lawyer tried to calm him, but Christopher was beyond reason. He picked up a chair and threw it against the wall, screaming that I was his property and Rachel was a whore who'd stolen his life. Security and then the police had to physically restrain him, dragging him out in handcuffs while he screamed my name. That night, Patricia drove me to an emergency foster placement. The Johnsons were an older couple with kind faces and a small bedroom decorated with dinosaur sheets. They seemed nice but confused about the whole situation, and I couldn't blame them. How do you explain that level of cruelty to normal people? I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with worry about Rachel and Grace alone in the hospital. Around midnight, I snuck to the kitchen and called Mrs. Peterson from the phone on the wall. She answered immediately like she'd been waiting. I promised her I'd visit Rachel first thing in the morning. True to her word, Mrs. Peterson picked me up early the next day before the Johnsons were even awake. She'd already cleared it with Patricia, who met us at the hospital. Rachel was sitting up in bed, feeding Grace, looking exhausted but determined. When she saw me, her face lit up. She reached out with her free hand, pulling me close. "I'm going to fight for you," she promised, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. "For both of you. I'm done being afraid. I'm done letting him control our lives." We had to leave for family court an hour later. Christopher, out on bail his parents had posted, sat with his lawyer looking smugly confident. His attorney argued that I should be returned to Christopher immediately, that the signed papers gave him full rights, that there was no evidence of abuse. But then Patricia Williams stood up with her mountain of evidence. She presented everything: the photos, the recordings, the witness statements, the medical records showing Rachel's malnutrition and injuries, the testimony from neighbors who'd heard the screaming and seen the control. The judge reviewed everything carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each document. After what felt like hours, he rendered his temporary decision. The minor child will remain in foster care while a full investigation is conducted. Mr. Thompson is ordered to have no contact with the child or with Ms. Morrison until further notice. Christopher slammed his fist on the table so hard that water glasses jumped. He stormed out with his lawyer trailing behind, but not before shooting a look at Rachel that promised this wasn't over. That afternoon, a new player entered the game. David Park arrived at Rachel's hospital room, introduced by Margaret as one of the city's best family law attorneys. David and Margaret were paying for his services, refusing to take no for an answer when Rachel protested. Mr. Park was young but sharp, with an intensity that suggested he took this case personally. He sat with Rachel for hours, going through every document Christopher had made her sign, photographing every injury, documenting the timeline of abuse. These signatures were obtained under duress, he explained, showing how Christopher had systematically isolated and controlled Rachel. "We can fight every one of these documents. We can prove coercion, fraud, and abuse. We can get you and Tyler both free from him." He took particular interest in the paternity test results, nodding thoughtfully. "He knew for 5 months and chose to torture you instead of simply filing for divorce. That shows malice and premeditation. We can use this." Then things got even more complicated. 3 days after Grace's birth, as I was visiting Rachel at the hospital, an older woman rushed into the room. Rachel gasped, "Mom," and they fell into each other's arms, both sobbing. Linda had flown in from California after Mrs. Peterson had managed to track her down through the Facebook messages I'd sent. The story that emerged was heartbreaking. Christopher had been threatening Linda for months, sending her messages saying he'd hurt Rachel if she tried to make contact. He'd blocked Linda's number on Rachel's phone, deleted her emails, and returned her letters unopened. Linda showed Patricia Williams dozens of saved text messages from Christopher, each more threatening than the last. "If you try to contact her, she'll pay the price. Stay away, or I'll make sure she suffers. You'll never see your daughter again if you interfere." There were voicemails too, Christopher's voice cold and menacing as he described what would happen if Linda violated his orders. Rachel hadn't known her mother had been desperately trying to reach her, had been fighting to help her escape. A week later, Dr. Patterson testified in a conference room at David Park's law office. She spread medical records across the table like evidence of a war crime, which in a way, they were. Rachel lost 15 pounds during her pregnancy instead of gaining the recommended weight. Her blood pressure readings showed dangerous spikes consistent with severe stress. "Look at these bruise patterns," she said, showing photographs she'd taken during examinations. "These aren't accidents. These are grip marks, consistent with someone grabbing her arms forcefully." Dr. Patterson pulled out notes from appointments where Rachel would cry throughout the entire examination, begging her not to call Christopher about anything concerning. She was terrified of him, the doctor stated firmly. I've seen abuse victims before, and Rachel showed all the classic signs: the flinching, the hypervigilance, the desperate attempts to hide injuries. I tried to get her help, but she was too scared to accept it. The system failed her, but we can make it right now. Meanwhile, I was required to meet with a child psychologist as part of the custody evaluation. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was filled with toys and art supplies, designed to make kids feel comfortable. She had me play with action figures while we talked, and without realizing it, I began acting out scenes from our home. The daddy figure pushed the mommy figure away when she tried to hug him. I built a house with blocks, then knocked down the room where the mommy figure stayed, explaining that's what Christopher did with Rachel's things. I showed her how dinner time worked, with the daddy figure sitting far away from everyone else, while the mommy figure cried in the corner. I demonstrated how the daddy stepped over the mommy when she fell down, how he locked doors to keep her inside, how he threw away her medicine. Dr. Chen took notes but also recorded our sessions, capturing not just my words but the pain and fear in my voice as I revealed the truth of our household through play. While Rachel recovered in the hospital, Christopher made his move on their property. The neighbors later testified that they saw him arrive with a moving truck and several men. He threw all of Rachel's belongings into garbage bags: her clothes, her jewelry, her grandmother's china, everything she treasured. When elderly Mrs. Robinson from next door asked what was happening, he told her Rachel had abandoned the family and he was cleaning out her mess. David and Margaret arrived just as Christopher was dragging Rachel's grandmother's antique rocking chair to the curb. That chair had been in Rachel's family for generations, the one she'd planned to rock Grace in. Margaret started grabbing photo albums and my school projects from the trash while David loaded what he could salvage into his truck. They saved what they could, but by the time they left, Christopher had already changed all the locks and removed Rachel's name from the mailbox. Her erasure from the home was nearly complete. The day Rachel was discharged from the hospital was bittersweet. Linda wheeled her out while she held Grace, wrapped in a hospital blanket because Christopher had thrown away all the baby items they'd bought together. They took a taxi to the hotel where Linda had been staying, and Rachel collapsed on the bed, still weak from the delivery and the months of deprivation. The hotel manager, learning of their situation, brought up a portable crib someone had left behind. Rachel tried to access their bank accounts from Linda's laptop, only to discover Christopher had removed her name from everything. Her car had been reported stolen and towed from the hospital parking lot. Her credit cards were cancelled. Even her cell phone had been shut off. She was effectively erased from the life they'd built together. Then came the divorce papers, delivered to the hotel by a process server. Christopher was claiming she was an unfit mother who had committed adultery and abandoned her foster child. He demanded full custody of me and stated she owed him damages for emotional distress and fraud. 2 weeks into our new reality, I couldn't stand being separated from Rachel any longer. The Johnsons were kind, but they weren't family. I waited until they were asleep, then carefully opened my bedroom window and climbed out. The 6-block walk to the bus stop felt like miles in the dark. The bus driver hesitated when he saw me, clearly a child traveling alone at night, but I showed him the emergency $20 bill Patricia had given me and told him I was going to see my mom in the hospital. When I knocked on Rachel's hotel room door, she answered holding Grace, looking thin and exhausted, but still managing a smile when she saw me. We spent the afternoon on the bed, Linda making sandwiches while I held Grace and taught her to grab my finger. "This feels like what family is supposed to be," Rachel said softly, watching Grace sleep in my arms. Nobody mentioned that I'd have to go back to foster care in a few hours. Nobody talked about Christopher's threats or the legal battles ahead. We just existed in that moment, 3 generations united by love and determination. David Park's office became our war room over the following weeks. He filed counter motions painting the real picture. Rachel as a victim of systematic domestic abuse and financial control. He submitted petitions for both children, arguing that Christopher posed a danger to minors. He demanded emergency spousal support, showing how Christopher had left Rachel destitute while hiding assets. The forensic accountant David hired found offshore accounts and evidence that Christopher had been planning this for months, moving money in preparation for leaving Rachel with nothing. Then came a shocking discovery. David's investigator found that Christopher had never actually finalized my adoption. All those years of calling me his son, of telling everyone the adoption was complete, were lies. I'd been in legal limbo, just a foster child with no permanent status. This revelation, while painful, actually worked in our favor. It meant Rachel could petition for custody independently without needing Christopher's consent. She could fight to be my legal mother on her own terms. The investigation also led to finding Grace's biological father. His name was Marcus, someone Rachel had dated briefly during a separation from Christopher years ago. When David Park contacted him, Marcus arrived at the office looking uncomfortable in work clothes and steel-toed boots. He reviewed the paternity test results without emotion, then signed papers relinquishing all parental rights without even asking to see Grace. "I have my own family now," he said simply. "I don't want any part of this drama." David said this was actually helpful, as it eliminated another potential custody challenger. My therapy sessions with Dr. Chen became crucial to the case. Twice a week, I drew pictures and played with toys while talking about my experiences. My drawings always showed Rachel and Grace in bright, warm colors at the center, while Christopher appeared as dark clouds or monsters on the edges. Dr. Chen testified that my emotional development had been significantly impacted by witnessing domestic abuse, but that my bond with Rachel was strong and healthy. She recommended that maintaining that relationship was crucial for my well-being. 3 weeks after Grace's birth, we faced our first major custody hearing. Christopher's legal team painted Rachel as a cheater who had defrauded him, making him believe he was going to be a father. They claimed she was unstable and unfit. But David Park systematically destroyed their narrative. He presented the paternity test results, dated 5 months before Grace's birth, proving Christopher knew the truth long before his campaign of abuse intensified. He showed Christopher's internet history, with searches about paternity tests dating back even further. The judge reviewed bank records showing Christopher had bought the test himself, destroying any claim that he'd been deceived. When you knew the truth, David argued, you had choices. You could have filed for divorce. You could have separated amicably. Instead, you chose to torture a pregnant woman, to endanger her life and the life of an innocent baby. That's not the behavior of a wronged husband. That's the behavior of an abuser who enjoyed inflicting pain. Then David revealed something that made everyone in the courtroom gasp. The forensic accountant had discovered that Rachel's grandmother had left her a small inheritance 2 years ago, around $50,000. Rachel had never known about it because Christopher had intercepted the letters from the lawyer and accessed the accounts using her information. He'd been slowly draining the money, using it for his own purposes while telling Rachel they were struggling financially. This wasn't just abuse, it was theft and fraud on a massive scale. The criminal charges were filed that same day. Christopher faced counts of domestic violence, theft, fraud, and violating the restraining order. His parents, wealthy and influential in the community, posted his bail again. But the damage to his reputation was severe. They couldn't buy his way out of the truth anymore. The evidence was too overwhelming, the witnesses too numerous, the paper trail too clear. 2 weeks before the final custody hearing, Christopher's parents launched a media campaign. They painted their son as a victim who'd been tricked into raising another man's child, now being persecuted for protecting himself from a manipulative woman. When Christopher was attacked in prison, suffering broken ribs in what was claimed to be a random assault, his parents seized the opportunity. They gave interviews to every outlet that would listen, showing pictures of him bandaged and vulnerable, claiming the stress of losing his foster son had made him a target. The story went viral with people who didn't know the facts attacking Rachel online. Our hotel address was leaked, and we started receiving threatening mail. Someone spray-painted baby thief on Linda's rental car. The harassment got so bad that Rachel started packing, ready to flee and start over somewhere else. But I unpacked her suitcase while she cried. "We don't run from bullies," I told her, repeating what she'd taught me. "We stand and fight." David and Margaret saw the media coverage and decided enough was enough. They released their own evidence online, the videos they'd secretly recorded of Christopher's abuse, photos of my injuries, screenshots of his own words admitting to the abuse. They wrote a detailed post about watching their nephew suffer while feeling powerless to stop it. The narrative shifted overnight as people saw the truth. Other women from Christopher's past came forward with their own stories of abuse, including one with a restraining order from college and another with hospital records. The final termination hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. Christopher appeared via video link from prison, wearing his orange jumpsuit. He attempted to cry as he spoke about being a changed man who deserved another chance with his son. But his tears seemed forced, his remorse scripted. When the judge asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I raised my hand. David helped me stand, and I addressed the court with all the courage a 10-year-old could muster. "Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking but clear, "Christopher never loved me. He used me as a weapon to hurt Rachel. She's my real mum because she chose to love me even when it cost her everything. She protected me, taught me right from wrong, and showed me what real family means. Please don't make me go back to him. Please let me stay with my real family." The judge thanked me for my bravery and said she would consider all the evidence before making her decision. That week of waiting was torture. Rachel couldn't eat or sleep properly, and even baby Grace seemed to sense the tension, crying more than usual. I found myself hiding in closets, overwhelmed by the fear that they might send me back to Christopher. Patricia found me one night curled up and sobbing, and held me while I voiced my worst fears. She assured me she'd already recommended permanent placement with Rachel in her report to the court. Finally, David called with the news. The judge had made her decision. We drove to the courthouse with Rachel's hands shaking so badly that Linda had to help her with her seatbelt. In the courtroom, the judge read her decision in a clear, strong voice. Based on extensive evidence of severe abuse, criminal conviction, child endangerment, and complete abandonment of parental responsibilities, Christopher Thompson's parental rights are hereby terminated. He is no longer recognized as this child's parent and has no claim to custody or visitation. The relief was overwhelming. Rachel collapsed into her chair, sobbing while I jumped into her arms. Even baby Grace, who'd been fussing, suddenly started making happy sounds, as if she understood we were finally safe. Patricia Williams started the adoption paperwork right there in the courthouse hallway, her own eyes misty as she watched us celebrate. The nightmare was ending, and our real life as a family could finally begin. The adoption process moved with surprising speed after that. Linda's sacrifice of selling her California home to pay legal fees had left us with resources to navigate the system properly. Patricia fast-tracked everything she could, calling in favors from judges and clerks who'd been following our case. Home studies were expedited, background checks rushed through, reference letters poured in from everyone who'd witnessed Rachel's devotion to me. One afternoon, Patricia called with an important question. We needed to choose my legal name for the adoption certificate. Rachel said I could keep my first name or choose something entirely new. I thought about it for days, writing different combinations in my notebook. Finally, I made my decision. I wanted to be Tyler James Park Morrison, taking Rachel's maiden name of Park, adding Morrison from Linda's side, and James to honor David, who'd stood up for us when it mattered most. When I explained my reasoning, Rachel cried happy tears. It was a name that told the story of who really loved me. The adoption finalization day arrived 3 months later. The courtroom was packed with everyone who'd supported us: Margaret, David, Dr. Patterson, Patricia, Mrs. Peterson, even some of the nurses from the hospital. The judge read through all the documentation, then asked Rachel if she understood she was taking full legal responsibility for me forever. Her yes was so loud and certain that baby Grace jumped in her carrier. Then the judge asked me if I wanted Rachel to be my legal mother. I practically shouted yes before she could finish the question. The judge smiled and signed the papers, making it official. Then came the tradition in adoption cases: she let me bang the gavel. As I brought it down, making it official, Grace made a sound that everyone swore sounded like tie-tie, which became her first real word, right there in the courtroom. The room erupted in applause and happy tears. I was no longer a foster child in limbo. I was Tyler James Park Morrison, Rachel's son, Grace's brother, part of a real family at last. At the celebration dinner that night at a local pizza place, Rachel asked me to stand up. I'd written a letter I'd been working on for weeks, and with everyone watching, I read it aloud. "Mom," I began, and had to pause because she was already crying. "You chose me when I was broken. You fought for me when I had no voice. You loved me when my blood family didn't. You showed me that real family isn't made by DNA, it's made by love, sacrifice, and choice. You're not my foster mom, or my adoptive mom. You're just my mom. And I love you more than all the stars in the sky, just like you taught me." 6 months after the adoption, we moved into a bigger apartment. Linda had become a permanent part of our household, helping with Grace and making sure Rachel continued recovering from her ordeal. We spent a weekend painting Grace's room pink and my room blue, working together as a family. As I watched my grandmother and mother laughing over paint splatters while Grace played in her bouncer, I thought about how far we'd come. By the time I started middle school, the past felt like a bad dream that was finally fading. When kids asked about my dad, I simply said I didn't have one, but I had the best mom, sister, and grandma in the world. The therapy sessions with Dr. Chen had helped me process the trauma, and I only needed to go once a month now. She said having a stable, loving home had made all the difference in my recovery. One afternoon, a letter arrived with Christopher's prison return address. I asked Rachel if we should read it, curious despite myself about what he might have to say. She looked at the envelope for a long moment, then dropped it in the trash without opening it. "He has no power here anymore," she said firmly. "Let's go plant our garden instead." We spent the rest of the afternoon planting tomatoes and flowers in the small plot behind our building, creating something beautiful that would grow and thrive. Grace took her first steps on an ordinary Thursday evening, pushing herself up from the carpet and toddling straight from Rachel to me. I caught her and spun her around while she giggled, and Linda managed to capture it all on video. As we played together, Rachel whispered my babies, and I realized she meant both of us equally. We were both her children, both chosen, both loved beyond measure. For a school project about resilience, I interviewed Rachel about her own childhood and what made her strong enough to survive what Christopher did to us. She told me about growing up with Linda's unconditional love, about learning that strength sometimes means asking for help, about how becoming a mother to me had taught her she could endure anything to protect her children. When I told her she was my hero, she cried and said I was hers for being brave enough to speak up when it mattered most. On Grace's 2nd birthday, I helped her blow out the candles on her cake. That night, it was my turn to put her to bed. I sang her the Spanish lullabies Linda had taught me, the same ones Rachel sang to us both. As I tucked her in, Rachel and Linda stood in the doorway watching. "We made it," I said softly, and the three of us stood there together, looking at Grace sleeping peacefully in her toddler bed. We were a family forged by choice rather than blood, tested by fire and Christopher's cruelty, but we were stronger for it. Rachel pulled me close and kissed the top of my head, while Linda wrapped her arms around both of us. Outside, the garden we'd planted was thriving, green shoots pushing through the soil and reaching toward the sun. Grace stirred in her sleep and murmured, "Tai-tai," which still made me smile every time. This was our family, built on love, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up to evil. We'd survived the worst and come out the other side together. As I looked at the three most important women in my life, I knew that sometimes the families we choose are stronger than the ones we're born into. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find people who will fight dragons to keep us safe, who will choose us over and over again, who will show us what love really means. The scars from that time would always be there, hidden beneath the surface. But scars mean you survived, you healed, you grew stronger. And we were all survivors here, even little Grace who'd entered the world under such difficult circumstances. We were the Park Morrison family, and nothing would ever tear us apart again. Love had won, and that victory was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of fear we'd endured to get here. As I write this now, years later, I still remember the 10-year-old boy who gathered evidence and protected his foster mother and baby sister. That boy was brave beyond his years, forced to grow up too fast but never losing his capacity for love. Rachel saved me first by choosing to be my mother when she didn't have to, and I like to think I saved her too by refusing to let Christopher's lies take root, by choosing her right back. That's what real family does. We save each other over and over again, as many times as it takes.